We already covered digestive anatomy, so let's start taking a look at urinary anatomy. Why don't I put all these labels up here and then we can just kind of talk about them in whatever order we want, because that's kind of the way my brain works. So you can see two kidneys. Sitting on top of each kidney is the adrenal gland. Adrenal, remember, means at the kidney. Adrenal. Little three-cornered hats on top of the kidney. Don't they look cute? Then coming out of the kidneys, we see these tubes called ureters. Ureter is the tube that takes urine from the kidney down to the urinary bladder. And you can't just say bladder because there are different kinds of bladders in the human body and in other animals. So we have to say urinary bladder. Then coming from the urinary bladder out to the world is the urethra. Don't mix up ureter and urethra. See the difference? Ureters are the tubes going from the kidney to the bladder. Urethra is the tube going from the bladder to the outside world. Here's an unusual view, but one I think is worth taking a look at for a moment. So you can see the two kidneys towards the posterior. See the spine there. See the muscles on the back, latissimus dorsi and various things. So then notice, you can see the two kidneys. Notice in the front part of the picture, we have liver, stomach, okay? And then over on the far left, we see the spleen as well. They don't have it marked on the organ. They have it marked with a little tag. But notice three big organs there, liver, stomach, and spleen going around. Those are all within the peritoneum. But then look right behind the stomach. See the pancreas? The pancreas is retroperitoneal, as are the kidneys. Once again, that makes a difference later on in terms of signs and symptoms according to where blood is going to connect. Also make a difference for surgery, whether or not you have to go through or don't have to go through the peritoneum. So a nice view here. I would say, just kind of look it over. It pays you back a lot because it's got a lot of, it helps you gain some command over the relationships, the spatial relationships of these organs, okay? Once again, an interesting view here from the side. You can see the little adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidney. Remember, another name for the adrenal gland is the suprarenal gland. It's on top of the kidney. All right, let's again put all of these up here so that my brain can just browse through them in whatever random order it happens to do it. Let's kidney shaped like a big giant kidney bean. Whoa, how convenient is that? Let's start into the hilum of the kidney. Remember, the hilum is the dented in part of an organ. We saw that on the spleen before when we covered the lymphatic system. So notice going into the hilum, and the hilum is naturally the place where things go in and out. That's why it's dented in. So notice the renal artery and vein, renal artery bringing oxygenated blood in, renal vein taking deox out. Then the tube below, see, is the ureter. That's where urine flows from the kidney to the urinary bladder, all right? Don't mix those up again, remember? Now let's take a look at the kidney in general. Notice how when we look at the cross section, when we look at the cutaway part, you can see out near the edge is a light colored band that goes all the way around. See on the left, they identify it as the renal cortex. Remember, cortex in Greek means the bark of a tree. Like on an old tree where you can literally just pull the bark off. Well, that's the bark of the kidney. Then, see those dark upside down triangles? There's 6 of them. Those are renal pyramids. And all the renal pyramids together, plus the structures around them, make up the renal medulla. So basically, the kidney has 2 main regions. Everything is in one of these regions. Everything is either in the renal cortex or it's in the renal medulla. Now, specifically, the renal medulla is made up of the pyramids and other things as well, okay? Look at the bottom of each individual pyramid, all right? See how it looks like it's going to drain out, and it is. That's a big drain there. It's called a minor calyx. So look at the 3 renal pyramids up on the top. See how each one has its own minor calyx that it drains into? But then look, the 3 minor calyces, calyces plural of calyx, singular, we have the major calyx. Then notice all the major calyces drain together into the renal pelvis, which is right there by the renal artery and vein. And then from there, urine drains into the ureter, okay? Now, look up at the top, that middle renal pyramid on the top. It's got that yellow tubing in it. That's a nephron. The nephron is the actual working machine of the kidney. That's what does the kidney's job. You have roughly 1 million nephrons, and when you lose them, that's the way they grade your kidney failure, all right? If you lose 300,000 nephrons, your kidneys are now working at only 70%. If you lose half your nephrons, your kidney's now at 50%. It's really just a direct proportion of how many nephrons you've got. So the nephron is where we're going to filter the blood and make urine. Then notice in that yellow tube picture then of the nephron, see how there's a long straight tube they call the collecting duct? The collecting duct is going to drain urine into the minor calyx. And at the very bottom, there's a nozzle on that collecting duct called the renal papilla. We've seen this before. We saw it with the major duodenal and minor duodenal papilla. Papilla is like a nozzle that squirts stuff in. So you can see here the renal papilla is where the urine leaves the collecting duct and goes into the minor calyx. Now looking again at an overview of the kidney, but focusing on some different structures this time, all right? So let's talk a little bit about the blood supply. We have the renal artery coming in. Notice it branches immediately into two big segments called segmental arteries. Then notice the artery and the vein as well are going to run in the renal column, in between the renal pyramids. Remember, the pyramids are the upside down triangles. The lighter space in between the pyramids is the renal column. Now remember, when we made a slice of kidney pie, I think we did that, I don't know, this, I've had to record this more than once. So, but if you take a sharp knife and cut down a renal column is the light space in between the pyramids, and then cut down on the other side, cut all the way out through the cortex, you'll end up with a slice of kidney pie. And that slice is called a lobe of the kidney. Therefore, the arteries that run up the renal columns, which are in between the lobes, are called the interlobar arteries, artery and vein, okay? Artery going up, vein coming down. Then notice that the artery and vein turn the corner to go over the top of the pyramid. They're called arcuate at that point. Arcuate means shaped like an arch. They make an arch, see? And then notice they still continue. There are arteries and veins up into the cortex, and we call those, because they radiate into the cortex, we call those cortical radiate. That's their most perfect and wonderful name. Now notice this diagram calls them interlobular. I highly discourage that because people invariably mix up interlobular with interlobar. So just forget the word interlobular. Don't ever use it. Interlobar goes up the renal columns and between the lobes, and then the ones that radiate into the cortex are the cortical radiate. Now looking at an entire nephron here. This is one nephron along with a collecting duct. Down there at the bottom you see the renal papilla, the nozzle, which is dripping urine into the minor calyx, okay? That would be down here at the bottom of the pyramid. So take a look there, all the machinery there right in the middle, up near the top in the middle. Notice a lot of tubes, a lot of blood vessels, and then there's a big red ball smack dab in the middle on the top. Do you see it? Let's put all the terms up here, and then we can start talking through them again in whatever random way my brain happens to think about them. But at least they'll be here written where you can see what the words look like. So we have the renal corpuscle. That's the big red ball. The corpuscle is the entire ball. The ball is composed of a case plus the inner workings, the innards. The case is called the renal capsule. In the old days, it was called the Bowman's capsule. The inner workings is the glomerulus. The glomerulus is all the blood vessels that are actually going to filter the blood, all right? So once again, it's not hard. Just keep it straight. The renal corpuscle is the whole thing. The outer covering is the capsule, and then the glomerulus is actually the blood vessels, the capillaries that do the work, okay? Now, look, here you can see, up here we have a neuron that's high up in the cortex. We call this a nephron. We call it a cortical nephron. So notice, coming up into the cortex, we see one of those blood vessels, which I told you we're always going to call cortical radiate arteries, even though the diagram calls it interlobular. That's terrible. So The cortical radiate artery comes up, and then see how it has a branch going into the glomerulus? That is the afferent arteriole. Then the glomerulus filters the blood, it swirls all around through the capillaries, and then it comes out through the efferent arteriole. Okay, see how easy? Then the efferent arteriole, look how it ends up like twisting all around, going all over the damn place, like exploring. We call those paratubular capillaries because they're going around the tubes of the kidney, tubules, whatever. So that takes care of the blood. Now let's look again at the corpuscle, again made of the outer capsule, the inner glomerulus. Emerging from the capsule, see how there's a yellow tube on the left? The proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal means nearby, and that's because it's nearest to the corpuscle. Convoluted because it's all twisty, that's what convoluted means. So see how the yellow tube twists all around until finally it straightens out and goes straight down. Where it goes straight down, we call that the descending loop. All right, so this loop used to be called the loop of Henle. Again, eponyms are out in science, so now this is the nephron loop, and we have the descending limb of the nephron loop. Notice then the nephron loop turns the corner at the bottom. This is full now of what we call filtrate. It's not yet urine because we're still modifying it, still putting things in and taking them out. Then notice we have the ascending limb of the nephron loop. Then it gets all twisty again. See, that's the distal convoluted tubule. All right, what's the deal? Why are they all convoluted around? Well, think about it. That slows the fluid down, doesn't it? Gives time. See how the paratubular capillaries are running all around those convoluted tubules? Yeah, so what's going to happen is that's how we're putting stuff in and taking things out. The PCT, as we call it, the proximal convoluted tubule, and the DCT, the distal convoluted tubule, those are the places where we do most of the modifying of what the glomerulus originally took out. Okay? Then we see that the distal convoluted tubule, the DCT, drains into the collecting duct. The collecting duct has lots of DCTs joining it, but when we get to the bottom, we get to a place finally where no more DCTs join in. That's where we call it the papillary duct. Okay, looking again at some of the same structures, just a slightly different view, talking about them a little bit differently. So there are a lot of parts, like I say. The kidney has a lot of working parts, and so the complexity in this anatomy is all the inner working parts. You know, just kidney and bladder and stuff, pretty easy. It's the inner parts that take a little time. So again, find the corpuscle, then the capsule, then the PCT, the descending loop, the ascending loop, the DCT, then the collecting duct, then the papillary duct, then the renal papilla, dripping urine into the minor calyx, okay? Notice here the blood vessels again. Now, previously we saw a nephron that was high up in the cortex, and all it had were paratubular capillaries. Notice this nephron, I keep saying neuron instead of nephron. Fine, laugh at me. Put it on my evaluations. So here we see a nephron that's down closer to the medulla, and there's a special word we use for this type of nephron. We say it is juxtamedullary. Juxta means next to, medullary, the medulla. So notice this nephron, its corpuscle is still in the cortex, but it's near the bottom of the cortex, and therefore its nephron loop descends deep into the renal medulla. Now here, the capillaries get a special name because what's happening, see how they run straight down the sides of the tubules on each side? They don't curl all around. I mean, yes, they have cross sections, but see how there are big sections of artery and vein that run right alongside the tubules? We call those vasa recta. Vasa means blood vessel, recta means straight, because they're big straight lines of blood vessels, okay? Now we're going to look inside of the corpuscle, okay? So let's put all these things up here, and once again, just talk about them a little bit. So here the corpuscle, remember, is made of the capsule. There you see up on the top, parietal layer of glomerular or Bowman's capsule, and then the glomerulus inside. The glomerulus is all the little capillaries. So The capsule itself has a outer layer, which we call the parietal layer. Once again, that's what the word parietal means, the wall. So the capsule, the outer layer of the capsule, is called the parietal layer of the glomerular capsule. But then, covering the capillaries of the glomerulus are special cells called podocytes. And podocytes form the visceral layer of the glomerulus. All right, get it? Stop, think about that for a minute. We've seen before many times, visceral and parietal. Visceral always means on the organ itself. Parietal means on the wall, on the outside layer. So here of the corpuscle, we have the capsule. The capsule has an outer wall, the parietal layer, and then the glomerulus has cells on it that form the visceral layer, okay? Notice, therefore, there is an artery coming in, that is the afferent arterial. The blood swirls through all those capillaries. That's where we filter stuff out. Then the blood comes back out through the efferent arterial. Notice both of those are therefore are coming in and going out right together. Then see, over on the far left, there's part of the ascending loop of Henle. Now, the next time we see a full view of the nephron, in fact, you should go back and take a look for yourself, you will see that the DCT comes up and basically does a drive-by of the corpuscle. It doesn't actually, no fluid leaves or enters. It just passes close by. So in that area of the ascending nephron loop, we have cells called macula densa cells, which we will talk about in lecture. So when we talk about them, I want you to be able to have that in your mind. Those are part of the ascending loop right by the DCT when it does its drive-by of the corpuscle. Okay, let's move on. That's all the kidney stuff. Everything was in there. You're just going to go back and slow down, watch the movie, and take it a little bit at a time. So here we have the urinary bladder. Remember, you can't just say bladder. Notice we have the two tubes coming down to it. Those are the two ureters, okay? Now, where the ureters enter the bladder, we have the urethral openings or orifices, okay? You can say either one, whatever I have on my sheet. Then notice the bladder all converges down into a drain, which is the internal urethral orifice. Makes sense, doesn't it? It's on the internal side of the urethra, and it's an opening. It is the internal urethral orifice. Notice that if you take that point of the internal urethral orifice and you go up to one of the urethral openings, then go across, then come back down, you will have drawn a little triangle. That triangle is called the trigone. That is a specific region of the bladder, okay? Then notice we have the urethra. So the urethra coming out, this is a female urethra. We can tell because it's very short. So there's the urethra, where the urethra then opens to the external world is the external urethral orifice. Now, notice there are two kinds of muscles. At the internal urethral orifice are the internal urethral sphincters. These are involuntary. When the bladder fills, they will open, and that's when you really start feeling that urge to pee. Fortunately, the external urethral orifice is skeletal muscle, so that's under your conscious control. You can hopefully save it until you find an appropriate place to pee, which might be your front yard, where you can wave at the neighbors go by. Say hi, yeah, that's me. Then notice on the top of, let's look inside the bladder. Here we have rugae again. We've seen rugae before, right? Remember the ridges? So again, this allows the bladder to expand, all right? It's the wrinkles that are basically tissue that allow for expansion. And then notice covering the bladder is peritoneum. That would be visceral peritoneum, right there on the bladder, okay? Here, a view of the female urethra. So 3 to 4 centimeters long. Anytime you're trying to convert centimeters to inches, just multiply by 4 and move the decimal. So that's 1.2 to 1.6 inches, okay? So 1.5 inches, okay? So there we have the internal and external urethral sphincters, internal involuntary and external voluntary. And I don't know how I did that, but I'm not sure I ever talked about the muscle of the bladder itself. That was the detrusor muscle. Sorry if I missed that. Go back and take a look. Here, Kanab Point. Parts of the Grand Canyon I go to, there aren't any, parking lots or buildings. There's just a four-wheel drive road, and you keep driving until you finally have to stop so that you don't accidentally do a Thelma and Louise and drive into the canyon. Okay, kids, this was about 20 minutes long. Hope you you need to take time now to study, get your book, all right, and start. Then you can use this to do those urinary labs. See you later.